All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for our SMA Stratcom Academic Alliance speaker session entitled Protections Price, Reassuring and Burden Sharing in U.S. Alliances. I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Brian Blankenship, for taking the time to present today. So before we begin, a few quick housekeeping items. Oh, there we go. We'll go ahead and have a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. So during the brief or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has two overlapping speech bubbles. One has a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question, or if you'd like for your name to not be recorded, go ahead and submit your question anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. My key isn't working right now. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speaker. Dr. Brian Blankenship is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Miami and a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. He's also a new member of Stratcom's Academic Alliance, and his research focuses on the politics of military alliances and foreign basing. He is also working on a book project that studies the conditions under which the U.S. encourages allies to assume more responsibility for their own defense and the conditions under which it's successful in doing so. So Dr. Blankenship, I'll turn the floor over to you now.
All right, well, thank you so much for that. So let me just see if I can share my screen here. Okay, is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thanks everyone so much for coming. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. This is still very much a work in progress. So any and all feedback is really quite welcome and will be quite helpful for me. So today I'm presenting some of my research which looks at the conditions under which the United States is more or less likely to be successful in persuading its allies to assume more responsibility for their own defense. And so really the kind of the lodestar, this sort of guiding question for this research is in trying to explain why is the U.S. successful in some cases in encouraging allies to assume more responsibility for their own defense, but less successful in other cases. And really, the motivation for this project is twofold. So on the one hand, concerns about burden sharing in U.S. alliances are really as old as the alliances themselves. Virtually every president has made it clear that encouraging allied burden sharing is an important priority. And you know, a notable recent example, of course, is President Trump, who has really made encouraging allied burden sharing a core tenet of his foreign policy, both as president and on the campaign trail. But you can see it as far back, at least as far back as presidents like John F. Kennedy, who really was really quite exasperated at what he perceived as insufficient burden sharing on the part of U.S. allies, particularly in NATO, and frequently levied the threat of troop withdrawals as a mean to try and encourage allies to assume more responsibility for their own defense. On the other hand, however, these efforts have had varying levels of success. So in some cases, the U.S. policymakers have been able to successfully encourage U.S. allies to spend more on defense, for example. So in the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter was able to leverage the possibility of U.S. troop withdrawals to encourage the South Koreans to really dramatically ramp up their own defense spending to around 6% of gross national product. By contrast, in other cases, U.S. pressure has been less successful. So a number of U.S. presidents during the 1960s and early 1970s, for example, tried to pressure Great Britain into maintaining its military presence in what was called east of Suez, so in Middle East, in the Middle East and in Asia, but ultimately were unsuccessful in doing so, and British retrenchment proceeded at a rate that was much faster than what U.S. policymakers would have preferred. And the conventional wisdom in the academic literature on burden sharing suggests that burden sharing is quite difficult, or should be quite difficult in U.S. alliances, as it will be in almost all asymmetric alliances between great powers like the United States and smaller allies. And this is the case for a number of reasons. The first explanation that's been offered is that smaller allies just really can't make that much of a difference in terms of their contributions. This was the argument famously put forward by folks like Olson and Zeckhauser, who argued that essentially when you have these sorts of asymmetric alliances, the larger countries in the alliance will inevitably share a disproportionate amount of the burden because it's ultimately their contributions that matter, whereas the smaller states will tend to free ride because they just don't have much to contribute. Another explanation is that essentially the nature of asymmetric alliances is such that inequitable burden sharing is built into the alliance, that it's part of the initial bargain of the alliance, that essentially the great power provides protection, and in return it gets other benefits, including basing access, including broader support for its foreign policy, support on issues of trade with third parties, support on issues of how to deal with third-party adversaries, and that essentially inequitable burden sharing is a feature and not a bug of these alliances. And a final basket of explanations is that essentially what really makes burden sharing difficult in U.S. alliances is the global nature of the U.S. Military presence. And the idea here is that by stationing so many troops abroad, for example, and by having so much military power in general, that the United States really removes any incentive that its allies have to contribute to the common defense. But there are some problems with what one might term this sort of conventional wisdom, and these problems are both empirical and theoretical. And so, empirically, there are a lot of cases that don't really seem to square with what this conventional wisdom might predict. So France, for example, was among the largest members of NATO, and continues to be to this day, but nevertheless withdrew from NATO's integrated military command in 1966. Likewise, Germany, at least since the end of the Cold War, has not been among NATO's top spenders on defense, and in fact has been at best around the middle. By contrast, a lot of smaller allies, including in recent years, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and as well as Poland, have by contrast really punched above their weight, both in terms of defense spending, but also in terms of contributing troops to Iraq, and during the Cold War, South Korea was similarly a major contributor to the Vietnam War. And more broadly, burden sharing often tends to rise and fall over time in ways that existing literature can't really account for. There was, for example, a pretty substantial rise in burden sharing during much of the 1970s, the period of détente. But there was, something of a plateau in much of the early 1980s in the period of the so-called Second Cold War. And just theoretically, there are reason to think that the U.S. might actually have quite a bit of leverage in encouraging its allies to increase their burden sharing efforts. And the first and most basic is just that the fact that its allies are weaker means that most of them, though by no means all of them, to the same degree, are going to be somewhat dependent on its protection, and that provides it with some leverage that it can use to encourage them to assume more responsibility for their own defense. And the second point is that it's not necessarily clear that the presence of U.S. troops should always have a suppressing effect on Allied burden sharing, because troop deployments and other forms of assurances aren't deployed randomly, right? They're often deployed in areas where they're most needed, right? So oftentimes these are allies on the front lines, so to speak, of being near shared adversaries. These are sometimes allies that are somewhat nervous about U.S. commitment and need reassuring in the first place. And so there's reason to think that the allies that actually receive more assurances may be actually more susceptible to U.S. pressure in the first place, because they're the ones that need assurances. So in this project, I really treat burden sharing as the outcome of a bargaining process between the United States and its allies. And the sort of starting point and sort of root assumption of the argument I make is rooted in a lot of the existing literature on bargaining and military alliances, which suggests that typically burden sharing in alliances tends to stem from fear of abandonment. And so the sort of basic argument I make is that the more allies believe that the United States has a credible threat of abandonment, and the more they actually need its protection, the more susceptible they're going to be to U.S. pressure. And so, this naturally raises a question. Well, when is the U.S. threat of abandonment credible? And in particular, I focus on a few factors, a few conditions that really enhance the U.S. threat of abandonment. And the first is when there is pressure from within the United States to retrench from foreign commitments. So in particular, when U.S. policymakers face a lot of domestic pressure for withdrawing troops from abroad, for cutting defense spending and reducing military readiness, and just more broadly, pressure to avoid foreign entanglements and foreign conflicts, this is likely to make allies nervous that they might be left more on their own if they're attacked. And so, one sort of working hypothesis I have in this project is that the more pressure U.S. policymakers face to retrench, the more successful they're likely to be in encouraging allied burden sharing. The second condition is when allies are less strategically valuable to the United States, and the logic here is fairly straightforward, and is basically that the less easily the United States can afford to see an ally leave the alliance or be conquered, the less likely that ally is to believe that the United States would actually abandon it or withhold protection, and so the less susceptible they will be to U.S. Persuasion attempts. And so what do we mean by strategic value? And in particular, I focus on sort of two components, two factors that make allies more or less strategically valuable to the United States. And the first of these is the U.S. perception of threat. And so basically the idea here is that to the extent the United States faces and fears an external threat from a great power adversary, the less likely the U.S. is to abandon its allies, or to even appear likely to abandon its allies, because doing so could have the effect of essentially encouraging its adversary to expand. And so the logic here is that the more threat the U.S. perceives, the more likely it's going to want partners to form a coalition against that adversary. And the second related component of strategic value is where allies are positioned, right? So their geostrategic positioning. Now, some allies are more strategically positioned than others to allow the United States to project power while at the same time denying adversaries the ability to do the same. And so in particular here, I focus on proximity to U.S. adversaries, right? So the idea here is that the closer you are to U.S. adversary, the more strategically valuable you are, because you essentially form a bulwark against that adversary's expansion and a useful departure point from which the U.S. can project power. And by similar logic, I would expect allies located near key maritime choke points located around U.S. adversaries to be regarded as strategically valuable. So a good example of this would be something like the Bosporus Strait in Turkey, which has long been regarded by Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, as sort of a key waterway that they would need to project power into the Mediterranean and more widely from the Black Sea Fleet. And so the second part of the argument is that it's not only that U.S. pressure is not only more successful when allies believe that it would abandon them, or believe that it might abandon them, but it's also more likely to be successful when allies are more dependent on U.S. protection. And so here, the key driving factor I focus on is allies' own perception of external threat. So, the logic here is straightforward. The more allies fear for their survival, the more reluctant they're likely to be to really go without U.S. protection, and so as a result, the U.S. has more leverage in dealing with allies that perceive a higher level of external threat. Now, you might have noticed that there's something of a tension here, and that tension is the tension between U.S. and allies' perception of threat. So these two factors point in different directions, right? So if you have a shared adversary that allies and the U.S. both fear, it's not entirely clear what effect this should have on burden sharing, because these effects might cancel out. So on the one hand, to the extent that the U.S. perceives a higher level of threat, this likely undercuts its leverage for burden sharing. On the other hand, though, allies' own perception of threat increases U.S. leverage for burden sharing. And so to be able to really explain variation in the success of U.S. pressure, there needs to be some way of distinguishing these two factors, so U.S. and ally threat perceptions. And really, adversary capabilities and behavior can't do it because these are observable to both the U.S. and to the ally. And so as a result, I focus on variation in allies' geographic position to try and explain their level of burden sharing. And so the idea here is that that allies closer to U.S. adversaries are more vulnerable to being abandoned. They're also more valuable, though, right? So every kilometer that an ally is closer to U.S. adversary makes them both more vulnerable and more valuable. And so really parsing out the net effect of all of this requires coming up with a set of factors that make allies more valuable or more vulnerable without doing the inverse. And so here in particular, what I argue is that allies that share a land border with shared adversaries tend to be the most susceptible to U.S. burden sharing pressure, because although they are more valuable by virtue of being very close to the shared adversary, which makes them valuable for containing an adversary's expansion and also for projecting power from the U.S.'s perspective, they're also uniquely vulnerable to attack. So that projecting power over land tends to be projecting power into a neighboring country via land tends to be much easier than doing some sort of amphibious invasion over even over a relatively small channel. And so the expectation I have is that proximity to shared adversaries on net isn't likely to have much effect on Allied burden sharing, unless they're contiguous to the shared adversary by land. And so if you are an ally like, say, West Germany during the Cold War or South Korea, you are uniquely vulnerable to attack by virtue of sharing a land border with the shared adversary, and so you're likely to be more susceptible to U.S. pressure. And so I test these claims using both quantitative and qualitative evidence drawn from U.S. alliances. And on the quantitative side, I use a sample of all allies that have defense pacts with the United States between 1950 and 2010. And here my main outcome variable is allies' military spending as a percentage of GDP, and I look both at change over time and also just at base levels. And so here I'm interested in understanding the effect of both of U.S. domestic pressure, which I measure using pieces of congressional legislation, so amendments, bills, resolutions that call for retrenchment from U.S. foreign commitments, and I also look at allies' geographic vulnerability, which I measure using whether or not they have a shared land border with a shared adversary, and I also measure allies' geostrategic position by looking at whether or not they're close to maritime choke points located around U.S. adversaries. So examples include, as I mentioned earlier, the Bosporus Strait in Turkey, the first island chain surrounding China, the Danish Straits around Denmark, and there are a handful of others as well that I'm happy to discuss. In the analysis, I also look at whether U.S. troops, whether the presence of U.S. troops affects allies' burden sharing level, and the conventional wisdom would suggest that they do, but as I alluded to earlier, I think there's reason to expect that they might not. And so I'll run through the results fairly quickly, since I know we're somewhat tight on time. Basically, the findings really tend to support the hypotheses that I had going in. So there's evidence, for example, that allies tend to increase their military spending when the United States faces domestic pressure from Congress. Likewise, there's evidence that the U.S. allies that are contiguous to a shared adversary by land tend to spend more on defense. Roughly almost a percentage point more on average, while those close to a maritime choke point tend to spend less, about 0.75% of GDP less on average, while those that are only contiguous to a shared adversary by sea rather really don't spend any more or any less than those that are further away. And the final finding from the quantitative evidence is that U.S. troop levels really don't have a clear effect on allied military spending. The effects are really quite small, but they're also not statistically significant from zero. And the explanation that I have for this is what I alluded to in the first part of the talk, which is that these things aren't deployed randomly, and that the areas in which they're they're deployed often tend to overlap with the areas in which they're most needed, and thus the allies that are most likely to be successful burden sharing candidates. I also, I'll run through this fairly quickly, but I'm happy to come back to it in the Q&A. I also look at a variety of qualitative evidence from a number of cases of U.S. alliances during the Cold War in particular, and one of these is West Germany. And so here, the expectation going in would be that West Germany would tend to be quite susceptible to U.S. burden sharing pressure by virtue of its being directly on the border with the Warsaw Pact. And indeed, this is what we see. So throughout the 1960s, which is the period that I look mostly at, but also more generally, U.S. officials were often quite successful in persuading the West Germans to really assume a fair degree of responsibility for their own defense. And in the 1960s, the main avenue by which this was pursued was through what were known as offset agreements. And basically, the logic here was that the United States incurred quite a bit of foreign exchange costs by virtue of its reliance on the gold standard, because it had so many troops in Germany, and so in an effort to offset its trade deficit, it essentially put pressure on the West Germans to offset these costs by purchasing large volumes of U.S. military equipment on the order of about $1 billion every couple of years or so, and these agreements were often quite acrimonious. U.S. policymakers were often quite blunt in their use of threats of troop withdrawals as a means of securing these offset agreements. But they also provided quite a bit of assurances, right? So U.S. pressure wasn't just the use of threats, but it was also the use of assurances. And these assurances often took the form of, if you provide this offset, troop levels won't really change, but if you don't, there's no guarantee. And this pressure only became more intense over the course of the 1960s and then into the early 1970s as a result of increasing congressional pressure for troop withdrawals. Largely, though not entirely, as a result of the Vietnam War, Congress was becoming quite impatient on the subject of burden sharing in NATO and also more broadly. And during the late 1960s and early 1970s, you really saw quite a bit of pressure from Congress for troop withdrawals from Europe, led most notably by Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. But other pieces of legislation were put forward as well. The Jackson Non-Amendment in 1973, for example, really required offset as a condition for U.S. troop levels in Europe. And this provided U.S. officials with a lot of leverage on issues of burden sharing. And as a result, the United States was able to secure quite a bit of offset in the early 1970s. And in West German military spending nearly doubled between 1970 and 1975. I looked at a few other cases as well, but I know I'm short on time, so I won't run through those. But I'm happy to come back to them in the Q&A. And so before I end, I want to talk about a few kind of major takeaways from the research I've done. And the first and most basic of these is that the United States is far from helpless in encouraging Allied burden sharing. Really, in a lot of historical cases, Washington has been able to successfully encourage Allied burden sharing. And typically it's done so through a combination of threats and assurances, right? And typically both are required, as I'll talk about in a couple of slides. That being said, the ability of the U.S. to secure greater burden sharing is not limitless. For example, it's relatively uncommon for there to be periods of domestic pressure that are really, really intense in terms of favoring retrenchment. And really, the period of the late 1960s, early 1970s was somewhat unique. Not unique in general, but unique in its intensity. Moreover, these periods tend to also come with downsides. So the fear of abandonment not only makes allies susceptible to U.S. pressure, but also is likely to lead them to consider other options. And this can include nuclear weapons, can also include trying to seek out closer alignment with third parties. It's no accident, for example, that South Korea and Taiwan both pursued nuclear weapons in the 1970s as a result of doubts about U.S. commitment. And more broadly, the number of allies that really have severely high perceptions of threat, so as to make them really quite vulnerable to U.S. persuasion, are limited in number. Typically, the number of allies that really fear for their survival tend not to be all allies, and so you're likely to see variation in who's susceptible and who's not. The second general implication is that reassurance and burden sharing shouldn't be seen as opposite poles, because in a lot of cases, the same allies that need assurances of support are also those that are most susceptible to U.S. pressure. West Germany provides a pretty solid example of this. West Germany was by far and away the largest host of U.S. peacetime forces since 1950. But the U.S. was also able in a number of cases to successfully pressure the West Germans to assume more responsibility for their own defense. And more broadly, threats by themselves aren't likely to be terribly effective. You're likely to both alienate partners and engender a lot of resentment. But moreover, pressure is most likely to be successful if allies believe that you won't withdraw if they do what you want them to do. Thomas Schelling, for example, famously argued that stop or I'll shoot is only an effective coercive threat if the target believes that if they do stop, you won't shoot anyway. And the third and final implication is that external threat is no guarantee of success in terms of burden sharing, because on the one hand, allies that perceive greater levels of threat are likely to be susceptible to U.S. burden sharing pressure. But on the opposite side of the coin, U.S. perception of threat undermines U.S. ability to secure greater burden sharing. And so, these two things are often quite hard to disentangle, and so it shouldn't be a surprise in a lot of cases that the simple presence of a threat isn't enough to make allies more susceptible to U.S. pressure. It has to be that they fear it more than the U.S. does. And so I think I'll cut the talk short here. Happy to talk about avenues for future research in the Q&A, but I think that there's plenty more to be done here. But with that, I think I'll open things up for the question and answer. So thank you for coming to the talk, and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you, Dr. Blankenship. So now we're going to go ahead and begin the Q&A portion of the team session. If you have a question, feel free to keep submitting those in the live event Q&A chat. So our first question comes from Wing Commander Jean-Christophe Oudre, and he's from the French Air Force. And this question is, burden sharing is closely linked with alliance effectiveness. The more the alliance would be perceived by allies as efficient, the more likely they'd be eager to share the burden. How do you analyze the NATO non-action in Ukraine events in 2014? Isn't it already the threat of abandonment?
Yeah, so on the issue of Ukraine in particular, I think that's a good example, and I think you sort of see this in the Baltic states in particular, where really this has been a sort of galvanizing event and really series of events for burden sharing in the NATO alliance. And you've really seen, in particular, the three Baltic states as well as Poland, in particular, really stepping up their their contributions to the alliance. We've also seen in other areas of the alliance as well, of course. From the U.S., you've seen it in terms of the European Reassurance Now Deterrence Initiative. You've seen it in a variety of NATO initiatives like the Enhanced Forward Presence and the very High Readiness Joint Task Force. And so, yeah, I think you could portray, I think, the events in Ukraine and even before that in Georgia as sort of events that really set in motion the burden sharing conversation in a way that they hadn't been previously. Even here, though, I think you can still see some you can see the influence of geography in terms of the relative contributions across the alliance, and so you really see, especially the frontline states, really assuming a relatively high proportion, or investing a relatively high proportion of GDP on defense, for example, whereas countries that are a bit further away, including Germany and others, not spending quite as much. Not to say that there aren't exceptions. Britain, France, two major exceptions to this rule, but I think even here you can see the influence of geography.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Steve Schenkel, and this question is: Can you discuss how your research would apply to China and Russia with regards to allies? Does the CSTO fit in with your research on the Russian and Chinese alliance in the future?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating question. And I've always wanted to do a sort of comparative study of burden sharing in U.S. alliances to say asymmetric alliances led by Russia or the Soviet Union even and China. And what's interesting about say the CSTO or other Russian alliances is that if you look at countries that are included in say, for example, data sets of alliances, Russian alliances often curiously overlap with, depending on how they're coded, with U.S. alliances in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And there are some states included who are nominally Russian allies that I think would probably say that Russia is the major threat they perceive as well, and so yeah, it's sort of difficult to say because U.S. alliances I think are somewhat distinctive in that they for one are highly voluntary, whereas, for example, say during the Cold War, Soviet alliances were largely coercive in nature. Though that's not to say there wasn't voluntary membership, is some degree of voluntarism as well. And the other thing that makes U.S. alliances, I think, somewhat unique is that the U.S. is just so much further away from its allies, and so these issues of credibility sort of inevitably rear their head simply because the U.S. is located, so many thousands of miles away, and so the possibility that the U.S. could abandon allies is easier to imagine than, say, China abandoning North Korea, or the Soviet Union or Russia abandoning its alliances simply because of geographic proximity, right? Russia can't extricate itself from its borders, and neither can China, whereas the U.S. is a Western hemispheric power that happens to have far-flung commitments elsewhere, and so the issues of credibility are, I think, take on a sort of unique dimension in U.S. alliances that's not necessarily the case in other alliances. But it's a great question, though, and I don't necessarily know that I have a solid answer, but it's something that I've been interested in thinking about more.
All right, thank you, Dr. Blankenship. Our next question is from Kirk Otterson at LANL, and he asks, some analysts have posited that the 2% of GDP metric isn't really a good measure of alliance burden sharing. In short, it's a blunt instrument that doesn't help get at what a country is spending on its defense dollars on. Any comments on this notion based on your research?
Yeah, I think this is quite right. And I'll go back a slide, and I think that one really fruitful area of research that I think could and should be done is to sort of really do more fine-grained research on burden sharing, because I think, very much to your point, percentage of GDP metrics are very blunt measures. They're useful. They're useful, especially for just a simple quantitative comparison, but they don't tell you much about what's happening under the hood. And so I think, for that reason, in the quantitative portion of my research, I look mainly at military spending, because it's something that's easy enough to measure. But in the qualitative portions of my research, you really see just how much variety is subsumed under these general percent of GDP targets. And so, yeah, I don't. I don't really have anything to. I don't really have much to add beyond, I think, the point that was raised in the question, which is that these are definitely rather blunt measures of burden sharing, and I think more work should be done to really look at burden sharing through a more micro level lens that really tries to study how countries, for example, can specialize in specific capabilities, right? So I know there's good work being done by some folks in academia right now that's looking at this issue of specialization, for example, and I think that work is quite valuable in getting us to more fine-grained understanding of burden sharing.
So, also related to this 2% GDP metric or threshold, we have a person that is asking, is there a potential to view burden sharing from a larger view, like infrastructure projects such as railways, roads, ports, to the other components that support major conflicts as industry, to be considered against the 2% threshold?
Yeah, I definitely, and I think especially since certainly during the Cold War as well, but I think especially since the end of the Cold War, in NATO in particular, there's been kind of a broadening of the menu of what's on the table in terms of burden sharing. So, in the 1990s, 2000s, for example, there really weren't many conventional threats in the way the Soviet Union posed on the horizon. And so, NATO increasingly looked toward out-of-area operations, for example, in Afghanistan, and in peacekeeping operations in Europe and in elsewhere. And I think definitely that I think this speaks to the previous point as well, that that I don't necessarily know that you can study. I mean, I think what I'm doing in my research is specifically looking at burden sharing in terms of allies assuming responsibility for their own defense, but that's by no means the only metric that's relevant. A number of NATO partners, for example, would argue that they punch well over their weight in terms of peacekeeping contributions, in terms of foreign aid, and there have been others. I think I alluded to the Baltic states that and Poland as well, that were among some of the larger contributors to the coalition of the willing in Iraq. And yeah, I guess I would just add that that's somewhat beyond the scope of my own research, and I think more could and should be done to try and tease out these alternative forms of burden sharing and see if, for example, the explanation for conventional military burden sharing that I have laid out here applies to burden sharing in other domains as well.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from the Director of SMA, Mr. Todd Beasy, and his question is, I think that we can all agree that all capabilities are not equal, and that in that kind or type of capability investment matters greatly, particularly when executing combined military operations on a modern battlefield or even humanitarian assistance missions. As we look to incentivize burden sharing, how do we foster the type of cooperation that allows for smart and mutually supportive investments?
Yeah, so I think one of the major takeaways I would highlight from my own research on the topic is that there are sometimes these debates between, should the U.S. reassure its allies, should it not, should it care about credibility, should it not, is do assurances of support remove allies' incentives for burden sharing? Do they not? And I think that I think that the better way of framing the issue is that both are required, right? So as in any partnership, your partners need to know that that you're on board, right? That you're not going to leave the partnership, but that doesn't mean there's not scope for sometimes hard bargaining. And in terms of deploying specialized capabilities in particular, I think it behooves the United States, if the goal was simply to pass off responsibility for defense to allies and say, you've got this all on your own, we're not going to help, then yes, then certainly, a major retrenchment, I think, would be compatible with that. If your goal is instead to incentivize allies to specialize in certain capabilities, to really have a division of labor in the alliance, then they're only likely to do that if they know that you're going to be there as well, right? And so there has to be there has to be a mutual negotiation to reach that point. And often easier said than done, right? These things often require a very deft use of assurances and pressure. But I don't think that a major retrenchment, for example, is the way you get to, for example, a more integrated, a more specialized alliance. I think that's more how you get to duplication in the alliance, is by saying you're on your own. We're not helping you. So, yeah, but I think it's a good question, and if there's a running theme in a lot of my answers to these questions, it's that I think I think more research is needed on a lot of these finer grained questions about specialized capabilities in integration in alliances.
All right, thank you, Dr. Blankenship. Our next question is from Matthew at DENS, and his question is: with the fall of the Soviet Union, the existential threat that at European borders has all but disappeared. This has left mostly I can't pronounce that word, conflicts across the Middle East aimed at the heading off the threat of terrorism and to maintain energy security, which many European nations are more reluctant to become involved in. How will this affect America's ability to push a burden-sharing philosophy in Western Europe, and should we expect a shift in focus to Middle Eastern allies?
Yeah, it's a good question, and in a lot of ways, the challenge of the challenge of the post-Cold War environment, I think somewhat more so than the Cold War environment, has been the diversity in threat perceptions across regions, right? So there's no longer a sort of overarching threat sort of holding U.S. alliances together, and there's even variation within regions. So in Europe, for example, there is there's some daylight between the concerns of say the Estonians who are much more worried about Russia, and those in Southern Europe who are more concerned about terrorism and about issues of immigration, and so getting a cohesive response out of these sort of differing priorities is quite difficult. And in the past few years, you've sort of seen some debate about and this isn't the Middle East in particular, but about what exactly is the role of Europe in, say, competition with China, right? And it's not entirely clear, because there's certainly some concerns about China, but they're less sort of hard security and more sort of issues of espionage, more issues of trade, whereas allies in East Asia, of course, are more concerned with China's hard power, and so in some sense, one could expect that if there was a sort of large overarching threat did emerge, if say you had a more a Chinese-Russian alliance, for example, that was quite cohesive, you might begin to see sorts of dynamics emerge as you did during the Cold War, where most U.S. allies really turned their eye toward the same thing. But short of that, I think you're likely to see sort of some allies prioritize some issues in the alliance more than others, right? So those in Southern Europe are likely to be more concerned about what's happening in the Middle East than those in Northeastern Europe who are more concerned with Russia. But yeah, I think it's one of the challenges of alliance management that the U.S. has faced in the post-Cold War environment in particular.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Eric Gartsky from UCSV. And his question is, can you talk a bit more about scope and scale? Grant strategy refers to regional, with regards to grant strategy, regional threats may be more important to protege than the US, leading to different emphasis. Also, US concern may be about security or stability, while the ally cares about the distribution of stakes in the other bargaining game, that with challengers. Do you have any comments regarding that?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and it are a good series of questions. And with regards to the first on regional threats, yeah, this is something that I've wrestled with in terms of the project, because you know, in a lot of ways, I think you can. I think you know, as was mentioned, you can imagine that there are going to be some adversaries that the ally cares more about than the U.S. does, and perhaps vice versa as well. And you know, I haven't really. In the research, I've mostly focused on sort of the effects of shared threat, in part because sort of measuring the degree of non-shared threat is something I've found sort of tricky to do, but in principle, I think you know what you'd be likely to see is that you know if an ally, for example, perceives an adversary that doesn't share with the U.S., then it could be more susceptible to U.S. pressure than those that don't. And I think you could, for example, explain the participation of the Baltic states, for example, in Iraq in 2003 as being a sort of preemptive or I suppose preventive attempt to try and really kind of gain favor and you know, establish a reputation as an important and loyal ally. You know, if Russia ever came knocking on the door, you know, during the early 2000s, Russia wasn't as much on the U.S. radar as it has become over the last decade or so. And so, I think the theory could be extended to explain variation on those grounds, that you're likely to see allies that face threats that the U.S. doesn't share to be more susceptible, and allies that don't share a U.S. perception of threat to be less susceptible. So if you're an ally that is bordering a U.S. adversary, but you don't really care that much about that adversary, you're not that worried, then you're likely to not be terribly likely to respond if the U.S. asks you to assume responsibility for a threat that you don't really yourself care that much about. And I'm sorry, could you repeat the second part of the question? I don't think I wrote that down fast enough.
Yeah, so he says also U.S. concern may be about security and stability, while the ally cares about the distribution of stakes in the other bargaining game, that with challengers.
That's interesting. I hadn't really. I had to think more about that to I think provide a good answer. I think in principle, I mean that certainly sounds quite plausible to me, that there's likely to be some asymmetry in terms of the perception of the stakes, right? That if you're the U.S., you're probably more likely to be preoccupied with maintaining the status quo than an ally that might want to potentially revise the status quo, or at a minimum to gain bargaining leverage vis-a-vis its adversaries in crisis disputes or just in negotiations more broadly. But yeah, I'd have to think more about that and how that might the theory might map onto that and incorporate that. But I think it's a good question.
All right, thank you. So our speaker has granted us a few extra minutes to go over. So we will take those few extra minutes to address our last question, which also comes from Mr. Todd Beasy. And this question is, over the years, leaders of allied countries have sometimes started openly discussing the assertion of their national sovereignty by proposing coming out from under the US security umbrella and building military independence. Japan and most recently France come to mind. Have you been following these initiatives, and how do they fit into the framework of your research?
Yeah, so I have been following them, and part of the project that I didn't incorporate into today's talk, but that is part of my sort of broader project is on the subject of when the U.S. actually desires its allies to assume more responsibility for their own defense, and it's not always obvious that it wants them to. And in particular, I think the examples that were brought up, I think are good ones, because part of the argument I make elsewhere in the project is that the larger allies become, they simultaneously become more tempting targets for burden sharing, right, insofar as they can relieve the U.S. of its burdens. But they also become more risky targets because, the more latent power the ally has at its disposal, and the easier it would be for that ally to essentially go its own way. As was mentioned, and so there's a very delicate balancing act, and in a lot of cases, both I think historically and in contemporary, there's been some reluctance to. In principle, allied burden sharing is a no-brainer, right? Who doesn't want to share the cost of the alliance and save some resources? But that's also likely to come with allies wanting more say in how they use those capabilities. And in the past several years, for example, you've seen this in the European context, where in principle, the Trump administration has been quite in favor of more NATO burden sharing, but when it seemed like that might take the form of sort of separate EU ventures, whether in terms of procurement or in terms of on the extreme end of the spectrum, a European army. Suddenly, that begins to, it begins to look a little less attractive, because that's something that could be autonomous from the U.S. and it could duplicate NATO. It could make NATO less relevant if the EU or some combination of EU states have their own venture that sort of allows them to become more autonomous from the U.S. And so, at the end of the day, this is a fundamental dilemma in U.S. alliances. This sort of dilemma between what I call control versus cost sharing. And it's one that I think U.S. policymakers have historically managed by generally treading fairly lightly in some cases. Though some allies are more capable of this sort of going their own way than others, and in those cases, if an ally is really dependent on U.S. protection, then encouraging them to really step up their burden sharing efforts isn't that risky. But the larger they get, and the more potentially self-reliant they are, the riskier it becomes. So I think this is something that U.S. policymakers that I think will continue to grapple with over the coming years.
All right, thank you, Dr. Blankenship. So that brings us to the end of today's speaker session. So I'd like to thank everyone again for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Brian Blankenship, for taking the time to present today.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. This was a lot of fun, and I got a lot of material to think about here.
All right, thanks so much.